Airport staff stopped an old veteran escorting a fallen soldier until the colonel ordered silence. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's begin. The airport was bustling with its usual hum of activity, passengers rushing to catch flights, and the loud clatter of luggage carts echoing through the terminal. But in the midst of the chaos, one moment stood still. An elderly man, his face weathered by time, stood at the security check-in counter, his hands clutching the folded American flag draped over the casket of a fallen soldier. His movements were slow, but purposeful, as he carefully adjusted the weight of the flag. He was not just any elderly man. He was a veteran, a man who had seen the horrors of war, and who had fought beside the soldier in that very casket. But today, none of that seemed to matter. The staff behind the counter exchanged looks, their eyes scanning him up and down, as if to determine if he belonged. A younger attendant, his uniform crisp and freshly pressed, stepped forward. "Sir, you can't take that casket through security," the attendant said, his voice a bit too loud, too authoritative. The man did not respond right away, his tired eyes still fixed on the flag. He knew the protocol. He had been through this routine before, many times in his life. "It's against the rules," the attendant insisted, raising his voice slightly, a tone of impatience creeping in. "You'll need to leave it behind." The elderly man's eyes finally lifted to meet the attendant's gaze. There was no anger in his expression, only quiet determination. He took a deep breath, the weight of his years showing in his every movement. "I'm not leaving him behind," he said, his voice low but steady. "He was my friend." The attendant looked around, as if hoping to find backup, and nodded for a supervisor to come over. A woman in a dark blue uniform approached, her steps brisk. She glanced at the man, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. "Sir, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to step aside," she said. "We can't allow this. You're holding up the line." The old man said nothing at first. His fingers gently stroked the edge of the flag, the symbol of his fallen comrade's sacrifice. "Please, step aside, or we'll have to call security," she continued, her tone cold and impatient. Just then, a voice came from behind them. "What seems to be the problem here?" The voice was calm, yet carried an unmistakable authority. The crowd around them seemed to shrink back as a tall man in a sharp military uniform approached. His presence was commanding. He moved through the terminal like someone who was used to being followed. "This man is causing a disturbance," the supervisor said quickly, as if to justify the situation. "We've asked him to move, but he refuses." The elderly man looked at the newcomer. The man was a colonel. His uniform, decorated with countless ribbons and insignia, marked him as someone of high rank. The colonel studied the elderly man for a moment before turning to the supervisor. "He stays," the colonel said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. The supervisor froze, stunned by the colonel's direct order. The elderly man stood up a little straighter, as if feeling the weight of something much larger than just the flag in his hands. The colonel looked at the attendant. "You will allow him to pass," the colonel commanded, his gaze unwavering. "And you will show respect." The terminal, once filled with the noise of a busy airport, seemed to fall into an eerie silence. No one spoke, no one moved. The old man slowly walked past the security gate, his head held high. Behind him, the colonel turned to the gathered passengers and security personnel. "This man is a hero," the colonel said, his voice carrying across the room. "You will treat him as such." In that moment, as the elderly man passed through the gate, the entire terminal seemed to stand at attention, an unspoken understanding passing through the crowd. The colonel's words echoed in the silence, and the elderly veteran, once dismissed and ignored, was now recognized for the hero he truly was. He was no longer just a forgotten man. He was a reminder of the sacrifices made, the bonds forged in the fires of war, and the respect that should never be denied. The colonel's voice, firm and commanding, echoed through the now silent terminal. The old veteran, once dismissed, was finally treated with the respect he deserved. As he passed through security, The once unfriendly atmosphere in the airport seemed to shift, the crowd parting to let him through. The man, who had stood his ground for his fallen comrade, now walked with the quiet dignity of someone who had earned more than just a place in the world. The colonel remained by his side, his presence a shield to protect the veteran from any further indignity. There was a sense of awe in the air. The passengers who had watched the interaction could not help but stare as the elderly man walked past, his steps steady and sure. The veteran did not speak a word, but the weight of his silence was enough to make everyone take notice. The colonel, following closely behind, glanced around the terminal. His stern expression softened slightly as he watched the old man, his thoughts momentarily drifting back to a time when he, too, had stood in this very place, not as a colonel, but as a soldier. He knew the power of silence, the power of respect. The elderly veteran reached the gate, where his flight was waiting. A crew member stood ready, but before he could speak, the colonel intervened. "He's with me," he said simply. The crew member, a young man barely out of his teens, looked at the colonel in disbelief before snapping to attention. The terminal was still abuzz with activity, but now, there was a hushed reverence that surrounded the old man. The colonel placed a hand gently on the veteran's shoulder. "You've earned this," he said quietly. The old man gave a small nod, his eyes focused on the flag draped over the casket. There was no need for further words. He had fought wars, seen things that most would never understand, and had lost comrades who would never come home. He didn't need anyone's approval. He just needed to fulfill the promise he had made to his friend, the promise to bring him home. The crew ushered the old man and the colonel through the gate and onto the tarmac, where the plane awaited. As they walked toward the aircraft, the colonel could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knew this was more than just a flight. It was a final journey, a final act of duty. The old man, who had fought in wars that most had forgotten, was now fulfilling his last mission, to bring his friend home, no matter the cost. The aircraft was a military cargo plane, big and imposing, its engines already running. The ground crew, stationed nearby, snapped to attention as the colonel and the elderly veteran approached. There was no need for words here, either. The colonel gave a brief nod to the crew chief, who immediately turned and signaled for the loading ramp to be lowered. As the ramp descended, the old veteran stopped, his gaze lingering on the casket. For a moment, it was as if the world around him had disappeared. There was only the flag, the soldier who had once stood beside him, and the promise he had made long ago. The colonel stood beside him, respecting the silence. He had been a soldier once, too. He knew how much this moment meant, and he understood that sometimes the deepest respect was shown in the quietest of gestures. Finally, the old man stepped onto the plane, his eyes never leaving the casket. The colonel followed, his hand resting lightly on the veteran's shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity. The ramp was raised, and the plane began to taxi down the runway, its engines roaring to life. The journey ahead would be long, but the old veteran had no doubt that he would carry out his final mission, just as he had done so many times before. As the plane lifted into the sky, the colonel glanced at the old man, who sat still, his eyes closed in quiet reflection. The airport, the terminal, and the world below seemed so far away now. In this moment, there was only the mission, the fallen soldier, and the deep, unspoken bond between two men who had seen the world through the same lens of sacrifice and honor. The colonel sat beside him in silence, knowing that this was the last journey of the veteran's life, but also the final, sacred mission he had undertaken. This was the last time he would carry a fallen comrade home, and it would be the last time anyone would ever question his right to do so. The plane soared higher into the sky, the earth below shrinking into a patchwork of green and brown. Inside the aircraft, the air was thick with a quiet that only came when the weight of something profound filled the room. The old veteran, still sitting in his seat, stared straight ahead, his hands resting gently on the casket. The colonel, standing a few feet away, watched him with a quiet respect. The hum of the plane's engines was the only sound, a constant reminder of the journey they were on. The veteran had not spoken since they boarded, his eyes distant, as if lost in memories only he could access. The colonel had been with him long enough to understand that silence often spoke louder than words. He knew the old man was reliving the past, the battles, the sacrifices, and the loss that had shaped him into who he was. There was no need for words, not now. The mission was simple yet monumental: bring the fallen soldier home. The veteran had made this promise years ago, and now he was fulfilling it, one last time. The colonel glanced at the flag draped over the casket. It fluttered slightly with the movement of the plane, as if acknowledging the significance of the journey. It was a small but powerful symbol of everything they had fought for, and everything that had been lost. The colonel walked over and sat down beside the veteran, his voice low but clear. "You did good," he said, his words soft but meaningful. The veteran didn't respond. He didn't need to. The colonel knew that the veteran's actions spoke louder than any words ever could. As the hours passed, the plane continued its flight, cutting through the vast expanse of sky. The colonel sat in silence, his thoughts drifting between the past and the present. He thought about the battles, the comrades lost, and the ones still fighting. He thought about the veterans who had returned home, but who had never truly left the war behind. He thought about the fallen soldier, the one who had given everything for their country, and now lay in the casket before them. The weight of it all was nearly suffocating. But it was the colonel's job to bear that weight, just as it had been his job to carry the burdens of his men in the past. The old veteran shifted in his seat, his eyes finally meeting the colonel's. There was a flicker of recognition in his gaze, a silent acknowledgement that they both understood the gravity of the moment. "I made a promise," the veteran said, his voice gravelly but resolute. The colonel nodded. "I know you did, and you're keeping it." The veteran's eyes softened for a moment, a brief flicker of emotion crossing his weathered face. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced once again by the calm, steady resolve that had defined him throughout his life. The plane began its descent, the lights of the airfield becoming visible below. The colonel stood and walked toward the front of the aircraft, signaling the crew to prepare for landing. The veteran remained seated, his hands resting once more on the casket. He had done his part. Now it was time to bring the soldier home. As the plane touched down on the tarmac, the ground crew was already in place, waiting for the casket to be unloaded. The colonel stepped off the plane first, his uniform crisp and neat. He gave a brief nod to the waiting soldiers, who snapped to attention in recognition of the fallen. The veteran followed slowly, his steps deliberate but unhurried. He didn't need the fanfare. This was not about him. It was about the promise he had made, and the honor of fulfilling it. The colonel remained by his side as they made their way to the waiting hearse, the air thick with the weight of the moment. The veteran stopped for a moment, his eyes scanning the tarmac, as if searching for something. Perhaps he was looking for the ghosts of his past, the comrades who had fought beside him, the ones who had never returned home. Perhaps he was simply taking one last look at the world that had shaped him. He didn't say a word, but the colonel knew exactly what he was feeling. The silence between them was comforting in its own way. They didn't need to speak. They didn't need to explain anything. They both understood what this moment meant. The veteran reached out and gently touched the casket, his fingers brushing the flag that covered it. A moment of quiet reverence passed between them. Then, without a word, the veteran turned and followed the colonel to the waiting vehicle. The funeral procession began, the solemn march to honor the fallen soldier, to bring him home, and to pay tribute to the bond between two men who had seen the world through the same lens of sacrifice and duty. The procession moved slowly, the air heavy with reverence as the hearse carrying the fallen soldier's casket made its way through the quiet streets. The old veteran, walking beside the colonel, kept his eyes forward, his face a mask of quiet determination. The journey was almost over. The promise he had made, so long ago, was finally being fulfilled. But even now, as they moved through the solemn procession, a sense of duty, a deep sense of responsibility, lingered in the air. The colonel glanced at the veteran, walking beside him, never once faltering in his step. He could see it in the old man's eyes, the years of service, the weight of loss, and the bond that only a soldier could understand. The colonel knew that the veteran had been through more than most could ever imagine, but there was a quiet strength in him that spoke volumes. This was a man who had seen it all, and yet, he carried on, never asking for recognition, never seeking the spotlight. The colonel couldn't help but respect him even more. The two men, united in their mission, walked side by side toward the small cemetery at the edge of town. The sky above was overcast, the clouds hanging low, as if the world itself was mourning the loss of the fallen soldier. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves of the trees that lined the road. It was a somber day, but it was also a day of finality, of closure. As they reached the cemetery gates, the veteran paused for a moment, his gaze falling on the small headstones scattered across the grass. Each one marked the resting place of a life that had been sacrificed, a life that, like the soldier they were escorting today, would never be forgotten. The veteran stood still, his hand slowly reaching out and resting gently on the casket once more. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but in that moment, he could feel the presence of his fallen comrades, those who had fought beside him, those who had given everything for a cause they believed in. It was as if they were with him now, walking beside him, just as they had so many years ago. The colonel stood next to him, silent, giving the old man the space he needed. He understood. He had seen the same thing in his own eyes. Those moments when the past would come rushing back, when the weight of the memories would settle heavy on the soul. But the colonel also knew that the veteran had a job to do, one final task to complete. The service was short but meaningful. The priest spoke words of comfort, but it was the gestures, the silent tributes, that spoke the loudest. The colonel stood at attention, his salute sharp and crisp. The veteran, too, saluted, his hand steady despite the years that had passed. As the final words were spoken and the casket was lowered into the ground, the veteran remained still, his gaze unwavering. The colonel stood by his side, offering quiet support. He knew that this was not just the burial of a soldier. It was the burial of a part of the veteran's own history, a chapter in a story that would never be fully understood by those who hadn't lived it. As the last of the mourners began to leave, the colonel and the veteran remained behind, standing in silence by the gravesite. The colonel could sense that the old man wasn't quite ready to leave yet. He needed this time, this final moment of reflection. The colonel understood. They both did. The colonel looked at the veteran, his voice low but respectful. "You did right by him," he said, his words sincere. The old man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the grave. "We all did," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. The colonel remained quiet, knowing that the words spoken were not just for the fallen soldier, but for all the soldiers who had fought beside them, who had given everything in the name of duty. There would be no grand ceremony for them. There would be no monuments built in their honor. But in moments like this, there was something even more meaningful. The quiet respect, the understanding between two men who had seen the horrors of war, who had lived through it all and come out the other side. They would never forget those who had fallen, and they would continue to carry their memory with them, always. The veteran turned to leave, his footsteps slow, but sure. The colonel followed closely behind, the two of them walking side by side, as they had so many times before. The journey was over, but the memory of the soldier, and the promise kept, would live on forever. The days following the funeral were quiet, almost too quiet. The colonel and the old veteran had returned to their respective lives, but the weight of the journey they had shared lingered in the air. The veteran, whose name had long been lost to history, now found himself at a crossroads. He had kept his promise, laid his comrade to rest, but the question of what to do next hung over him. The colonel, for his part, had offered to assist the veteran in any way he could, but the old man was not one to seek help. He had fought his battles alone, and he would continue to do so. The colonel had seen the same fire in the old man's eyes that he had seen in his own, many years ago. It was the fire of someone who had nothing left to prove, but who still felt the need to keep going, to honor those who had come before him. The colonel respected that. A week later, the colonel received a call. It was from the veteran. "Colonel," the old man's voice was steady but tired. "I need your help with something." The colonel, surprised by the call but not questioning it, agreed immediately. "Of course. What do you need?" The veteran hesitated for a moment, as if considering the weight of his next words. "There are more of us out there. Men who fought in the same wars. Men who gave everything and were forgotten. I need you to help me find them." The colonel was silent for a moment. He had never thought of the old man's struggle as one that extended beyond his own personal loss, but now he understood. This was not just about one fallen soldier. This was about honoring a generation of men who had sacrificed without recognition. The colonel's response was simple. "I'm with you." The task was not an easy one. The colonel had connections, of course, But the veterans the old man sought were not always easy to find. Some had fallen off the grid entirely. Others had buried their memories too deep to want to relive them. But the old man, for all his age, had a way of reaching them, of finding the ones who had slipped through the cracks. It was a small but determined network they built, a group of men who had once fought together and now found solace in each other's company. The first meeting took place in a small-town diner, a place where the past seemed to hang in the air. The veteran arrived first, his worn jacket still bearing the insignia of a unit long forgotten by most. He had no need for fanfare. He was just one of the men, a reminder of the past they all shared. As the others arrived, one by one, they sat down at the table, their faces etched with the same lines of time, their eyes carrying the same stories. The colonel watched, not saying a word, but taking in the sight of these men who had all been written off by the world. There was no ceremony here, no speeches, just the simple understanding that they had all been through the fire together. The meeting was short, but powerful. The old man, the colonel, and the rest of the group spoke little, but the weight of the room spoke volumes. These were men who had seen things no one should ever have to see, and yet they had survived, carrying the burden of their experiences. The colonel could see the impact of their shared history, the bond they had forged. It was a bond that would never be broken, no matter how much time passed. When the meeting ended, the old man stood up, his back straighter than it had been in years. He shook the colonel's hand, a firm grip that spoke of mutual respect. "Thank you, Colonel," he said simply. The colonel nodded. "It's the least I could do." The old man turned to leave, his footsteps slow but steady. The colonel watched him go, knowing that this was just the beginning. They would continue to find the others, continue to honor those who had been forgotten. They would create a network, a family, of men who had fought together, who had bled together, and who would never be forgotten again. The colonel knew that the old man had finally found his peace. He had fulfilled his promise, not just to one fallen soldier, but to all the men who had stood beside him. And for that, the colonel would forever be grateful. The old man's mission had never been about recognition, never about glory. It was simply about doing what was right. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The colonel stood up, walking toward the door of the diner, a sense of finality settling over him. The journey had come full circle, but there was still work to be done. The world had long since moved on, but for these men, the fight was not over. It was just beginning. The group of veterans continued to grow, their network expanding slowly but surely. The old man and the colonel worked tirelessly, reaching out to other men who had been through the same hell, finding those who had once fought beside them. Each new veteran they found was another piece of the puzzle, another story of sacrifice, survival, and brotherhood. For the colonel, it was a mission that never seemed to end. The more veterans they gathered, the more he understood just how deep the scars ran. These were not just physical wounds. These were the emotional and psychological marks left by a lifetime of war. Yet, every man they found carried with him a quiet dignity, a strength that could not be measured by the battles they had fought, but by the lives they had lived. It wasn't just about honoring the past anymore. It was about making sure that these men were never forgotten, that their stories would be told, and that they would receive the respect they deserved. One evening, months after the first meeting, the old man called the colonel with urgent news. "I found him," the old man said, his voice low and filled with emotion. "I've found the one we've been looking for." The colonel, surprised by the call but not questioning it, responded quickly. "Who?" "It's James," the old man said. "He was with us in the war. He disappeared after, and no one's heard from him in years. But I've got a lead. We can find him." The colonel didn't hesitate. "Where is he?" The old man gave him an address, a small town on the outskirts of the state. It wasn't far, but it was a place that the colonel knew well enough to understand that James had been hiding for a reason. James was a man who had seen the worst of what war could do to a person. He had been in more battles than most could count, and when it was all over, he had simply disappeared. The colonel knew that some men didn't return from war, not in body, not in mind, and not in spirit. But he also knew that James was important. He was part of the brotherhood, and it was time to bring him back. The colonel met the old man the next morning, and they set out together. It wasn't the first time they had gone looking for a missing veteran, but there was something different this time. This wasn't just about finding someone. This was about finding a brother, a piece of their shared history that had been lost. The drive was long, and the roads twisted and turned, but neither man spoke much along the way. They didn't need to. They both knew what they were doing. They both understood the weight of the mission. When they reached the small town, they pulled into a quiet neighborhood, and the old man pointed to a run-down house on the corner. It was clear that time had not been kind to the place, just as it had not been kind to the man who had lived there. The colonel stepped out of the car first, his boots hitting the gravel with a heavy thud. He could feel the tension in the air, a familiar feeling that came with every search. The old man followed closely behind, his face a mixture of hope and fear. They walked up to the door and knocked. It was a long moment before the door creaked open. The man who answered was thin, his face gaunt, and his eyes hollow. It was clear that James had seen better days. But even in his worn appearance, the colonel recognized the man he had fought beside all those years ago. "James," the old man said, his voice thick with emotion. James looked at them for a long moment, his eyes scanning both men. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough and hoarse. "I thought I'd left it all behind," he said quietly. The old man stepped forward, his hand reaching out to touch James's arm. "You don't have to be alone anymore," he said. "We're here. We've been looking for you." James shook his head slowly, tears welling in his eyes. "I couldn't come back," he whispered. "Not after what happened." The colonel stepped forward, his voice firm but compassionate. "James, you're not alone. We've all been through hell, but we're still here. We're still fighting for each other. You don't have to carry this weight by yourself anymore." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with the truth that had been long buried. James stood there, his back straightening slightly, as if the weight of those words had finally started to settle in. Slowly he nodded. "I've missed you guys," he said, his voice cracking. "I've missed you too," the old man replied, his voice thick with emotion. The reunion was quiet, filled with the unsaid understanding of men who had seen the worst of what life could offer. There were no grand speeches, no fanfare, just a simple understanding that they had found each other again. They weren't alone anymore. The colonel, the old man, and James stood there together for a moment, letting the silence speak for them. Then, without a word, the colonel turned and walked toward the car. James followed, a slow but steady step behind. It was time to move forward, to bring this brother home. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew they would face it together. And that was enough. The days that followed their reunion were not easy. James, the colonel, and the old man spent time together, but it was clear that healing would take time. The wounds that each of them carried were deep, and while their reunion was a reminder of the bond they shared, it was also a stark reminder of the long road ahead. James had been living in seclusion, hiding from the world and from himself. It was clear he had been running from something, but no one forced him to speak about it. The old man, who had seen and lived through his own share of pain, understood the need for space. They gave James that space, allowing him to adjust to the idea of being part of something again. The colonel kept his distance as well, always there when needed but never pushing too hard. As the weeks passed, the bond between the three men grew stronger, the silence less heavy, the understanding more complete. They spent their days working together on the farm, fixing the old truck that had been left untouched for years, and talking little but meaning everything in the quiet moments between tasks. For James, it was a reminder of the life he had left behind, a life of purpose and belonging. For the colonel and the old man, it was a chance to give back, to offer what little they could to help James rebuild. It wasn't easy, and some days were harder than others, but together, they found their way forward. One day, the old man received a call. It was from another veteran, someone he had served with decades ago, someone who had been part of a long-lost unit. "I heard about what you're doing," the voice on the other end said. "I've been thinking about the men we lost, and I wanted to reach out." The old man smiled as he listened to the voice, recognizing it immediately. It was the sound of another brother who had carried the same burdens. "It's good to hear from you," the old man replied. "We've been finding the others." The conversation was brief, but it was a reminder that they were not alone, that there were more men out there, still living with the echoes of the past. It was time to reach out again. The next morning, the colonel and the old man met with James. "We're not done yet," the old man said. "There are others. We can't stop now." James looked at them, his eyes tired but focused. "I know," he said, his voice steady. "I'm ready." The decision was made. They would continue their mission to find the others, the men who had fought alongside them, and who now lived in the shadows of their own memories. It was a mission that would take them across the country, searching for the forgotten, the lost, and the ones who had fallen through the cracks. But this time, they weren't just searching for bodies. They were searching for lives, for stories that had been buried by time, for men who had sacrificed everything and deserved to be remembered. Weeks turned into months as the trio traveled from town to town, from one quiet diner to another, from one broken-down house to the next. They found a few, but not all. Some had passed on, while others had simply disappeared into the vastness of the country. But they found enough. They found the ones who had stories to tell, who had once fought and bled for their country, and who had been forgotten by everyone but their brothers. It wasn't easy. The memories were painful, and the stories were hard to hear. But the old man, the colonel, and James knew it was necessary. They had to honor these men, to give them the recognition they deserved. And with each man they found, with each story they heard, they grew stronger. It wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about the future, about ensuring that these men's sacrifices would never be forgotten. One afternoon, after another long search, they sat together on a porch, watching the sun set over the horizon. James had changed. He wasn't the man he had been when they first found him. He was quieter, but there was peace in his eyes now, something that had been missing before. The colonel turned to him, a small smile on his face. "You did good, James," he said. James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We all did," he replied. The old man, sitting beside them, looked out at the horizon. "It's not about what we did," he said, his voice soft. "It's about what we do now. We carry their memories. We carry their stories." The colonel and James both nodded. They had been through so much, and they had come so far. But they knew the work wasn't over. There were still men to find, stories to tell, and memories to keep alive. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, they all knew that they would continue this mission for as long as they could. They were not alone anymore. They were part of something larger than themselves, a brotherhood that would never fade, a bond that would last through time and beyond. And for the first time in years, the old man felt a sense of peace, knowing that the stories they had fought so hard to keep alive would never be forgotten. As the weeks passed, the old man, the colonel, and James found themselves deeper into the mission than they had ever anticipated. They had gathered a small group of veterans, men who had served alongside each other during the wars of the past, and each had their own story to tell. The work was exhausting, physically, emotionally, and mentally, but it felt right. It felt like they were doing something important, something that mattered. They weren't just finding old comrades. They were building a bridge between the past and the present, ensuring that those who had served were never forgotten. The road trips became routine, their faces growing familiar to the small-town diners and quiet neighborhoods they passed through. In every town, in every city, they found at least one veteran who had been forgotten or who had been hiding from the world for years. Some were too far gone, too broken by time and war to remember what they had once been. Others had quietly withdrawn, living in the shadows of their memories. But each time they found one, it felt like a small victory. The old man, once reluctant to open up, had begun to share his own story with the men they found. And slowly, James began to share his too. He was still haunted by the war, but he no longer felt alone in that haunting. He wasn't the only one who had suffered, and he wasn't the only one who had survived. The colonel, who had watched the other two men change, realized that the mission they had started was becoming more than just about finding veterans. It was about healing, about sharing the weight of their pasts, and about understanding that they were all still living in the aftershocks of their shared experiences. One day, after a particularly long trip, the group stopped in a quiet town to rest. The veteran they had just found, an older man with a weathered face and a gentle spirit, had shared a painful memory of losing his platoon in a brutal ambush. His voice cracked as he spoke, and the old man sat quietly beside him, his hand on the veteran's shoulder. James, for the first time since he'd joined them, found himself speaking up. "We've all lost something," he said softly, his voice still rough but clear. "We've all paid the price." The room fell silent, and the weight of James's words hung in the air. The colonel glanced at the others, seeing the same understanding reflected in their eyes. There was no denying it. The scars of war went far beyond the physical wounds. It was in the way they carried themselves, in the way they spoke, or didn't speak, about their experiences. But in that moment, as they sat together, there was a sense of peace. They weren't just fellow soldiers anymore. They were brothers. And they would continue to carry each other through the rest of their lives. Over time, their little group began to grow. More veterans came forward, seeking the same sense of connection, the same healing that the colonel, the old man, and James had found together. The trio became a foundation for something larger, a movement of veterans helping veterans, a community of men who had fought together and now stood together in the quiet aftermath of war. The colonel watched as they began to open up to each other, sharing stories they had kept locked away for years, if not decades. There was a bond that only those who had served together could understand, and slowly, that bond began to heal the wounds they had carried for so long. It wasn't just about finding them. It wasn't just about listening to their stories. It was about being there for each other, in the way only they could. The group began to meet regularly, and they found strength in each other. They started to volunteer, helping out at local charities and supporting the families of fallen soldiers. The work they did wasn't glamorous, and it didn't come with awards or recognition. But to them, it was enough. They were doing something real, something that mattered. As the years went by, the colonel, the old man, and James saw the fruits of their labor. They had built a community, and that community had helped to heal the wounds of many soldiers who had felt forgotten, isolated, and alone. One evening, after another long day of working with their group, the old man sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He had come a long way since the day he had first stepped into that airport, carrying the casket of his fallen comrade. He had come a long way since the days of running and hiding from the past. And now, with the men he had once fought alongside, he knew that his mission had been completed. The colonel sat beside him, both men silent as they looked out at the sky. The weight of their journey, of the years of sacrifice, had not been easy to bear, but they had carried it together. And that, in the end, was what had made all the difference. James, who had joined them on that first day and had grown into the man he was today, walked up beside them. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The three of them sat there, in the quiet of the evening, knowing that the journey they had started so many years ago had come full circle. They had found each other, and they had helped others find their way. They were no longer just soldiers. They were brothers. And that bond, forged in the fires of war, would never be broken. The sun had set, and the last light of the day was fading, casting a soft glow over the small town where the group of veterans had made their home. The days had turned into months, and the work they had started together was taking on a life of its own. More and more men came forward, some hesitant, others eager, but all sharing one common thread, a history that had been buried for too long. The old man, the colonel, and James had become more than just a group of individuals. They were the heart of a movement that was spreading slowly but steadily across the country. It wasn't something that could be measured by numbers or recognized by awards. It was something deeper, something that could only be felt in the quiet exchanges between men who had fought together and now stood together in the quiet aftermath of war. One evening, after another long day of reaching out to veterans, the group gathered in the same small diner they had visited countless times before. The old man sat at the same table, his hands resting on the surface, his eyes distant but content. James was beside him, a slight smile on his face, though the weight of the past still lingered in his eyes. The colonel, as always, sat across from them, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his gaze steady. They had just finished another meeting with a group of veterans who had come to share their stories. Some had been to war, others had stayed behind, but all of them had experienced the pain of losing comrades, the pain of living with memories that could never be erased. The colonel looked around the table at the men who had become like family to him. They had come so far since that first meeting, and yet, there was still work to be done. He could feel it in the air, a sense of unfinished business that hovered over them all. You know, the colonel began, breaking the silence. We've done a lot of good here. But there's more out there. More men who need us. More who don't even know we're here. The old man nodded, his eyes thoughtful. There will always be more, he said quietly. But we've made a difference. We've given them something they didn't have before, each other. James looked at both of them, his voice low but firm. We're not done yet, he said. There are still too many out there, men who are still fighting their own battles in silence. The colonel and the old man both looked at James, their expressions serious. They knew that what he said was true. The work they had started had never been about the glory or recognition. It had always been about helping those who had been left behind, forgotten by a world that had moved on without them. And James was right. There were still too many men out there, living in the shadows of their own memories, struggling to find their place in a world that had moved on without them. The colonel leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room. The diner was quiet now, the few patrons who remained lost in their own thoughts. He had always believed that the strength of a nation lay in its people, in the quiet acts of service and sacrifice that were never recognized. But this, what they had started, was different. It wasn't about the nation. It was about the men who had served, the men who had given everything for a cause, and who had been forgotten by the very people they had fought to protect. He had seen enough of the world to know that it wasn't always fair. It wasn't always just. But in this small town, in this group of veterans, there was justice. There was a place for them. And they would make sure that the world knew who they were. "We'll keep going," the colonel said finally, his voice steady. "We'll keep finding them, keep bringing them together. We'll build something that lasts." The old man smiled, a rare sight, but one that spoke volumes. "We've already built something," he said. "And it's not just about finding the others. It's about making sure they know they're not alone anymore." James nodded, his eyes meeting theirs. "Together," he said simply. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like the three of them were standing on the edge of something bigger than themselves. The journey they had started, the work they had done, had brought them to this point. But it wasn't over. There were still men out there who needed them. And they would find them, one by one, until the bond between them all could never be broken. The old man, the colonel, and James finished their coffee in silence, knowing that their mission was far from over. But they also knew that they had something the world could never take from them. A brotherhood forged in the fires of war, and a commitment to each other that would last as long as they drew breath. The world had moved on, but they had not forgotten, and they never would. As the months continued to pass, the group of veterans grew, and with each new face they encountered, a deeper sense of purpose anchored itself within the old man, the colonel, and James. Their mission, once a simple act of finding each other, had turned into something far more significant. They were now a network, a community of men who had survived wars, endured loss, and yet still found the strength to stand together. The weight of what they had built settled on their shoulders each day, but so did the sense of fulfillment that came with knowing they were making a difference. The colonel, who had once been a man of action, had learned to appreciate the quiet moments that came with the work. He wasn't leading soldiers on a battlefield anymore. Instead, he was helping his brothers find peace in a world that had left them behind. He had seen enough combat to last a lifetime, but the quiet acts of service he now engaged in felt like some of his most important work. For James, the transformation was even more profound. He had once been a broken man, hiding from the world, carrying the weight of his past on his shoulders. But now, he had found his place again. He had found his brothers, and together they were doing something that mattered. The scars from his time in the war were still there, still etched deeply in his mind, but they no longer held him captive. Each day, as he worked alongside the colonel and the old man, he felt the burden lift just a little more. The old man, too, found his purpose reaffirmed with every passing day. He had been a man of few words, a soldier who had seen the worst of war, and who had lived a life that few could truly understand. But with each new veteran they found, with each new story shared, he saw the strength in their shared experiences. He saw that their stories were worth telling, that their sacrifices had not been in vain. And as he watched James and the colonel grow, as he watched the men they had helped find healing and connection, he knew that this mission had been worth every step. One afternoon, as they sat together after another long day, the colonel turned to the old man and James. "There's a ceremony coming up," he said quietly, his gaze thoughtful. "A ceremony to honor veterans. It's not much, but it's something." The old man looked at him, his brow furrowed. "What kind of ceremony?" he asked. The colonel's lips curved into a small smile. "It's for us. For all of us. It's about time the world knew we were still here." James looked at the colonel, then at the old man, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The old man, too, looked at the colonel, then nodded slowly. "We've earned it," he said, his voice steady. The ceremony was simple, but the impact it had on the veterans who attended was profound. It wasn't about medals or honors. It wasn't about speeches or grand gestures. It was about acknowledging the men who had given everything, the ones who had fought and bled and lost so much, and who had never asked for recognition. The old man, the colonel, and James stood at the front of the ceremony, their eyes scanning the crowd of veterans who had come to be part of something they had long been denied. For a moment, it felt like they were all back together, like the weight of the years, the wars, the losses had been lifted, and all that remained was the bond they shared. The ceremony ended, but the impact of it lingered. As they walked away from the gathering, the old man turned to the colonel and James. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his eyes determined. "We've still got work to do. There are more men out there who need us." James nodded, his face set with a quiet resolve. "We'll find them," he said. And with that, the three men, who had once been lost in their own ways, continued on their journey, knowing that the work they were doing wasn't about recognition or glory. It was about making sure no veteran was ever left behind again. They were a brotherhood, bound by their shared past, their struggles, and their sacrifices. And as long as they had breath in their lungs, they would carry on, finding each other and healing the wounds of the past one step at a time. As the months turned into years, the work of the old man, the colonel, and James continued to spread across the country. Their mission to find the lost veterans, those who had fought alongside them and been forgotten by society, had taken on a life of its own. What had started as a small group of men in a diner had become a movement, a lifeline for those who had been left behind. The colonel and the old man, though still haunted by their pasts, found a sense of peace in this work. It wasn't the peace they had expected, but it was peace nonetheless. They were no longer just survivors of war. They were healers, bringing together men who had been scattered by time and trauma. And James, once a broken soul, now stood beside them as a testament to the strength of brotherhood. His journey had been long and difficult, but he had found his place among them, and he had found peace in ways he never thought possible. The trio was no longer just searching for others, they were building something. The network of veterans they had started to create was growing stronger, with each new face bringing a new story, a new connection. And with each story shared, each life remembered, they found the power of healing in community. The colonel, the old man, and James had become more than just a team. They had become the foundation of something much larger. They were a family. The old man, whose face had once been a mask of grief and loss, now found himself surrounded by the very men who had once stood by his side in battle. He no longer carried his pain in silence. Instead, he shared it with others who understood, others who had lived through the same things. And in those moments, when they gathered to share their stories, the weight of their experiences seemed to lighten. The colonel, ever the leader, had learned to step back. He had always been the one giving orders, the one who led soldiers into battle. But now, he had found a new role, that of a listener. He knew that healing wasn't just about telling others what to do. It was about hearing their stories, offering support, and standing by them as they faced the ghosts of their past. James, who had once been lost in his own darkness, now found himself in a position where he could offer guidance to the others. He had walked the hardest path, the one that took him through the deepest valleys of pain and regret. But he had emerged stronger, and now he was able to give something back. His experiences, once a source of shame, had become a source of strength for others who struggled in silence. As they continued to grow their network, the colonel, the old man, and James began to realize that the work they were doing was changing lives in ways they hadn't fully understood at the start. They had set out to find the lost veterans, but what they had found along the way was far more important: a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, and a renewed commitment to each other. One evening, as they sat in the same diner where it had all begun, the colonel looked at the two men who had become his closest friends, his brothers. The old man, though quieter than ever, was smiling. James, more at peace than he had ever been, was laughing. The colonel couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. This was not the life he had expected, but it was the one he had found. And for the first time in a long while, he was content. "We've come a long way," the colonel said quietly. The old man nodded. "We've done good," he replied. James smiled, his eyes reflecting a quiet pride. We've only just begun. The colonel looked at him, his face softening. You're right. There's still a lot of work to do. The three of them sat there for a moment, each lost in their thoughts, knowing that the journey they had started was far from over. There were still veterans to find, still lives to change, and still stories to be told. But they weren't in this alone anymore. They had each other. And for the first time in their lives, that was enough. As the sun set on another day, they knew they were not just a group of survivors. They were a team, a family, bound by the past, but looking toward the future. The road ahead would be long, but they would face it together, as they always had. And with each new veteran they brought into the fold, the bond between them would only grow stronger. The colonel, the old man, and James knew that the work they had done had made a difference. But more than that, they knew that it had made them who they were. Brothers. And that bond would never break. The work that the colonel, the old man, and James had started was now more than just a mission. It had become a way of life. The network of veterans they had built together continued to grow, not just across the country, but also within their hearts. As the years passed, they found themselves traveling more, visiting more towns, finding more men who needed help. There were still veterans who had slipped through the cracks, who had been forgotten, and it was up to them to make sure they weren't left behind. It was no longer just about offering support or providing a space for shared stories. It was about creating a legacy, a movement that would honor all the men who had served, whether they were still alive or had long since passed. The colonel, once a man of action and orders, had evolved into something different. He was no longer just a leader on a battlefield. Now, he was a leader of men in the quiet aftermath of war. His role had changed, but the responsibility he felt for his brothers remained the same. He often thought back to the day when he had first crossed paths with the old man, when they had met at that small diner, unsure of what they were beginning. Now, looking at the strength of the community they had built, he understood. It had always been about the bonds they shared, the commitment to never let each other fall. James, too, had transformed. He had once been broken, hiding from the world, carrying the weight of guilt and memories that threatened to consume him. But now, standing beside the colonel and the old man, he had found peace. He had found his purpose, and in doing so, had helped others find theirs. Every new veteran they brought into the fold brought with it new healing, new strength. But there was still one part of the mission that James had never fully understood until recently. The healing wasn't just for the others. It was for him, too. The old man, ever the quiet observer, had seen the transformation in James. He had seen the way the younger man had begun to embrace the role of leader, the way he had taken on the responsibility of helping others with the same fierce determination that he had once carried in the field. The old man knew that James had come full circle, that he had found his place in the world again, and that his healing, too, had come through helping others. It was a powerful realization, one that resonated deeply with the old man. He had once believed that healing could only come through solitude and silence. But now, as he looked at James and the colonel, he understood that healing came from sharing the load, from carrying it together. One day, after another successful meeting with a group of veterans, the old man sat quietly in his favorite chair, looking out over the quiet town they had made their home. The colonel and James were busy organizing the next steps, planning another trip to reach more veterans. But for the old man, it was a time to reflect. The journey had been long. The wounds they had all carried, both physical and emotional, were still there, but they no longer defined them. They had learned to live with them, to carry them with dignity, and to find meaning in the shared experiences of their brotherhood. The old man had long since let go of the anger and resentment that had once filled his heart. He had no need for recognition, no desire for glory. What he had found instead was something more precious: peace. The sun was setting as the old man closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself a brief respite from the weight of the years. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. James entered the room, a rare smile on his face. "We're ready to go," James said, his voice filled with purpose. The old man nodded, his heart swelling with pride. The work wasn't done, and it never would be. But he knew that they had done something incredible together. They had built a legacy that would continue to grow, that would continue to honor the men who had served and sacrificed. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about ensuring that the next generation of veterans, and the ones after that, would never feel forgotten. They had made sure of that. "Let's go," the old man said, rising slowly from his chair. As they walked out the door, the colonel turned to them, his face set with determination. "There's still work to do," he said. "We've come this far, but we haven't reached the end yet." The old man smiled, his eyes shining with quiet resolve. "No," he agreed. "But we will. Together." And with that, the three of them walked out into the fading light, ready to continue their mission, knowing that the journey was far from over. But with each step, they were making the world a little bit smaller, a little bit kinder, and a little bit more connected for the men who had fought, bled, and died in silence. They would carry their stories, their legacies, and their memories for as long as they could, because no soldier, no veteran, would ever be forgotten again. As the years rolled on, the work that the colonel, the old man, and James had started only deepened. What began as a small effort to help fellow veterans had become a movement that stretched across the country. The network they built, once centered around just a few men, had blossomed into something more, a beacon of support for veterans who had been forgotten, isolated, or lost to time. The trio had become more than just colleagues. They were brothers in arms, bound by their shared history and the knowledge that they were giving others a chance to heal, to find their way back from the darkness that so many of them had endured. As the group expanded, so did their reach. Every new veteran they met, every story they heard, reinforced the understanding that there were more like them, scattered across the nation, waiting for someone to find them, to help them reconnect with their past, and ultimately, themselves. The colonel, who had once commanded soldiers in battle, had now become a commander of a different sort, a commander of healing. His job was no longer to lead soldiers into combat, but to lead them into recovery, into a place where they could share their pain without fear of judgment. The old man, once a man of silence and solitude, now found himself sharing his story with anyone who would listen. He had once thought that the burden of his past was too great to share, but now, as he listened to the others speak, he realized that their stories were his stories, too. They were all connected by the same thread of sacrifice, loss, and survival. And as each new veteran joined their network, that thread grew stronger. James, too, had changed. He had once carried the weight of war alone, never asking for help, believing that the pain was his to bear. But as he worked alongside the colonel and the old man, he discovered that sharing that pain made it lighter. By helping others, he was helping himself. And as he stood next to his brothers, listening to the stories of men who had faced the same battles, he realized that he was no longer fighting alone. One day, after another long day of work, the colonel, the old man, and James sat down in their usual spot, an old diner where it all started. The years had worn the diner down, but it still felt like home. It had witnessed their transformations, their struggles, and their triumphs. The colonel, who had always been a man of few words, broke the silence. "We've done something," he said, his voice steady. "We've built something." The old man nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "It's not just about us," he said quietly. "It's about all of them." James looked at both of them, his eyes reflecting the depth of their journey. "We've given them a chance," he said. "We've given them a way out." The colonel smiled, though it was small, and there was a hint of weariness in his eyes. "And we've given ourselves a chance," he said. "A chance to do what's right." The three of them sat there in silence, the weight of their accomplishments sinking in. They had started with nothing more than a shared sense of duty and a desire to help those who had been forgotten. Now, they had built something that would last. It wasn't just a network. It was a legacy. The years they had spent traveling, finding other veterans, hearing their stories, and helping them heal had been worth every minute. They had given these men something priceless, a sense of belonging. But the work was far from done. There were still men out there who had not yet been reached, still stories waiting to be heard. The colonel, the old man, and James knew that their mission would never truly end. They would continue to find the others, continue to bring them together, continue to heal. They had all been through hell together, and now, they would walk through the rest of life side by side. And as the sun set on another day, the trio sat in silence, knowing that the journey had brought them all the way here, not just for the veterans they had found, but for themselves. The world had long since moved on from the wars they had fought, but they would never forget. They would never be forgotten. And with each step they took forward, they knew that the bonds they had formed, the brotherhood they had built, would endure forever. This emotional story follows the journey of three veterans who find strength, healing, and camaraderie in each other after years of isolation. The tale begins with a solemn mission to honor a fallen comrade, and evolves into a movement that brings together men who have been forgotten by society. Each chapter in this emotional story reveals the deep scars of war, both physical and psychological, and how these veterans support each other through shared experiences. As they reunite with lost brothers, they not only find healing for themselves, but also create a network of support for other forgotten heroes. Through this emotional story, the bond of brotherhood shines as the veterans build a lasting legacy of honor and remembrance. The journey through hardship, sacrifice, and ultimate redemption is a powerful emotional story that highlights the unbreakable connections forged in battle, and the strength of coming together in the face of adversity. With each new chapter, the emotional story unfolds to show that the road to healing is long, but it is best traveled together with those who truly understand the weight of war.